Welcome to my presentation about Jewish research in Northern Germany. My name is Andrea Benschneider, and in 2004 I founded my professional German genealogy research company called Beyond History. And since then, my team and I have helped more than 1,700 people from around the world gaining access to their roots and their family histories in German territories. So please take note of this code here. You can use it to evaluate this presentation. I will show the code once more at the end on the last slide. So again, today I will be talking about Jewish research in Northern Germany. And since this is such a vast field with countless topics to address, I can only scratch the surface of what is available and will focus basically on records during the 18th and 19th century and only touching the beginning of the 20th century. And one cannot talk about anything related to genealogy in German countries without looking into the history and geography. And it's also important to remember that many records were lost due to fires, to wars, and misguided archivists who willingly destroyed whole collections just out of reasons of incorrect evaluation, as it just fairly recently, a few years ago, happened at the Hamburg State Archive, when a whole collection of the death notification records were destroyed for good. So when you look into the history, you will see that the records vary greatly, also depending on when a person lived and where the person lived. And different types of records are kept at different places. So some records may be located at a state archive, others may be located in city or district level archives, or even in museums. And I will be talking about records that pertain strictly to Jewish residents or Jewish people, as well as general records that cover all kinds of groups regardless of their ethnic, racial, or other backgrounds, religious backgrounds. I'll be showing also different kinds of records so that you can see what is available at the different areas. And during the course of the presentations, I will show you maps to identify the areas that I'm talking about. So today we're talking about Northern Germany. So this covers the current German states of Lower Saxony, which used to be the Kingdom of Hanover, the duchies of Oldenburg and actually Braunschweig, the free cities of Bremen, Hamburg, and back then it was the free city of Lübeck, and the current territory of Schleswig-Holstein, as well as just the old Grand Duchies of Mecklenburg-Schwerin and Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Also, there is a handout available, so you will find more information, website, literatures, and other information and sources where you may find more information, so please refer to that. And the first records of Jews in Northern Germany basically begin in the 1200s and 1300s. And usually they settled until the mid-1500s, when they were blamed for the Black Death and hence chased away. But they did come back later on, and generated in their lives and their experience, that generated the records that I'm talking about today. So the first kind of political entity of like a combination of several different states was founded in the Middle Ages and lasted until 1806, which was the Holy Roman Empire of German nations. It lasted until its dissolution in 1806 during the Napoleonic Wars. So most of Europe was occupied by Napoleon from 1806 until 1815. So you see a map of like this whole area was all under French rule. So, and while this had a big influence on everyone who lived in that area, particularly since Napoleon introduced also the French model and French laws there. So it meant all of a sudden equal opportunities for all Jews who lived in these occupied territories. Unfortunately, most of them were stripped after the defeat of Napoleon again in 1815 or even earlier. So the French occupation started, or was the beginning, or the end of the French occupation was the beginning of the German Federation, which lasted until 1866. And it was a loose confederation of the 35 different states and 4 free cities, which were formed after the defeat of Napoleon. And you have to understand that you see all these different kingdoms, you see Prussia, even Austria was part of this confederation. And you see, like, there was not one common emperor or ruler, there was not one parliament, no chancellor, no common army or navy, not even a common capital in that time. Also, no common currency, no common customs union, and not even uniform weights and measures. So every state, every free city still had their own rules and regulations, and that also applied to the system of record keeping. This German Confederation was followed by a North German Confederation, which only lasted from 1867 until 1701, and which was basically under anything north of the Main River, which is like the Frankfurt area, was under Prussian leadership. And this then went into the German Empire, which was founded on January 1st, 1871, and lasted until the end of the First World War. So you see everything that's green on here, that's what belonged to the Kingdom of Prussia. And these yellow areas, which were not really Prussian then, but they also went into the German Empire. So out of the former 35 individual states, you now all of a sudden only had 22 monarchs and 3 free cities, and they all agreed to come together and join in alliance in form of this German Empire. And to give you an idea, the German Empire had about the size of the states of California and New York combined. But the area that I'm actually talking about today is what is considered Northern Germany today. So to give you an idea, we have the North Sea, here are the Netherlands. So everything in this lightish, greenish air is what used to be the Kingdom of Hanover, with the Duchy of Oldenburg, and also the bluish areas are the Duchy of Brunswick. You have then the city of Bremen is here, you have the city of Hamburg, and the city of Lübeck, then followed by the Duchy of Holstein, the Duchy of Schleswig, which all were like tied together with the Danish kingdom. And part of it kind of since the Danish king was also always the Duke of both Holstein and Schleswig. So, and last but not least, we have the areas of Mecklenburg-Schwerin and Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Just like for you to identify, Berlin is down here, but we will not cover Berlin as it was part of Prussia. So again, let me refer you to the handout. It depends a little bit on that some documents are classified at a certain archive, also based on the territory and location at the time when the document was generated. And so then it also could be based on the territory it belongs to today. So you will see, like particularly with Braunschweig or with Oldenburg, you still have separate archives there today, although today it all belongs to Lower Saxony, for example. So it's a little bit difficult. We have governmental state archives that usually hold records of more general interest with regard to governmental bodies, finances, justice, financial claims, military, etc. The municipal archives or district and city archives usually hold records that are more of a regional interest and may include actual files and records about persons, for example, civil certificates, citizenship records, etc. Last but not least, we do have central archives, and I'm aware that I'm talking about Jewish records. However, in many areas, particular rural areas, when there was no Jewish congregation, it was still the duty of the local pastor or priest to record Jewish births, marriages, or deaths. And you also have those persons converting from one religion to the other. And so that's why I do want to mention the Christian church records. Also, always a good address to go if you have any questions, look for the local genealogy association. They are always very helpful. And to point out how difficult it may be to find records for just one place, my favorite example is the town of Altona. And Altona is just outside of the city of Hamburg. So this is where the city of Hamburg is located, and just outside in front of its door, basically to the left, you have Altona. Altona used to be in the biggest city of the Duchy of Holstein. And there, I think I found 7, 8, or I'm probably at 10 different archives where you can find records about Altona. So let's begin. In Altona, there is a city archive. So you do find records at the city archive. Since 1937, Altona became part of the city-state of Hamburg. So many records, including the Jewish records of Altona, are now located at the State Archive of Hamburg. Since it was also, again, I mentioned it was part of the Duchy of Holstein, so now the responsible state archive for this area is located in Schleswig. So there are Jewish records there as well, for example, for all of Schleswig-Holstein, but you do find records pertaining to Altona in Schleswig. And since it was also in combination with the Danish kingdom, in Copenhagen at the State Archive, you will find records about Altona as well. Then there was this time from 1867 on when Altona was actually Prussian. So here in Berlin, you may find records at the Secret Archive of Prussian Cultural Heritage in Berlin. And then, of course, then you have also copies of the Jewish records from Altona at the State Archive in Leipzig. I will talk about that a little bit more. And since most, or actually all of the records pertaining to the Jewish communities and congregations of Hamburg and Altona are also not just available at the Hamburg State Archive, but they also can be found at the Central Archive for the History of Jewish People in Jerusalem. Sorry, my map wasn't big enough to fit Jerusalem on there too. Otherwise, we never would have found Altona on this map again. So again, it's like if you're looking at any sources, it's always important to see who recorded it and when was it recorded. So was it recorded when the person was still alive and was the person possibly present, or was it done many years afterwards? So that will give you an idea of how accurate that the information in the record may be. And then also, did you check an original source, or was it just like someone's account of something that happened? And also, last but not least, it's always good to verify if a source is complete. Maybe a few years are missing, maybe a few pages are missing, and just because you cannot find a certain person in a set of record or in a collection doesn't mean the person never lived there. It just may mean the person's records are on these missing pages. Most of the records, Jewish records, are written in Hebrew, Yiddish, or German. I'm not going into these traditional records like that I mentioned here, because like these were usually more in like a private possession in the families, or stayed with the owners or the persons who created it, obviously not with the cemeteries, but I talk about sources, books, materials that are available at archives today. So basically the sources for Jewish genealogy starts in the 1700s and 1800s. it was, again, I mentioned it before, that priests and pastors were asked to keep registers of Jewish births, marriages, and deaths, which in most cases they did not keep. So they were supposed to, but they didn't. And as long as Jews were not citizens, there was not really like an importance attached to them being recorded in registers. Like, and so really it just like with the change of the French Revolution and also the emancipation coming from the Prussian times, it was that more interest came, and it was more and with the growth of the Jewish population, like the local governments became more interested in recording their Jewish residents. You know, they also traveled a lot, like Jews were known for traveling a lot. And so that's why hardly any personal records exist, because like they only kept their documents. And when you're traveling, you don't want to schlep around so many things. And so they were told to keep most of the records for 3 years after an event was recorded. And so afterwards, many records were just disposed of. And so, and it was more and more communities were open and opened the right for residence for Jewish persons. And so they had to buy certain rights to either travel through, come back, and respectively, so they had these escort letters, or they had the concession, respectively, protection letters. And these were basically, like for the local governments, it meant an additional source of income. Yet today, it still is a great source to get such early records. With names, sometimes with dates, you can pinpoint the local residences of your ancestors. However, these protection letters only lasted through 1812, basically, and which was then as a result of the invasion by Napoleon that this was discontinued. Because, like, again, all of a sudden Jews had equal rights, and so many of these documents were not necessary anymore. So here are some examples of Jewish civil records, and they start at different places, they start at different times. This is an example of a birth record from the Jewish congregation in Twistringen, which is nowadays located in Lower Saxony, and these records are located at the State Archive in Hanover. Here's another example of like a birth register from Schwerin, Mecklenburg-Schwerin, located at the State Archive in Schwerin, in Schwerin. And here's an example of what the marriage certificate or civil marriage registers of the Jewish congregation in Hamburg looked like. And this is an example of a death record also from the Jewish congregation in Bad Pyrmont, also located in Lower Saxony. And you see this really shabby quality and this really dark and difficult to read and make out copy. And that has to do with the fact that numerous registers relating to Jews were confiscated by the Reichsfamily Office in the Nazi area, and they were filmed by a company called Gartermann to secure them. The original films, together with the original records, actually, and registers, were lost during the war. However, the Gartermann company, they made copies of these films, and these films then were later on sold to certain archives. They were also, I don't know how to what extent they were freely handed over to archives. And some of the places include the State Archive in Leipzig. It includes the Heidelberg Central Archives of Jews, the Frankfurt Jewish Museum. I know the State Archives in Stuttgart got those from the areas of Württemberg, Baden, and Hohenzollern. And so these films also for those congregations in Lower Saxony, former Kingdom of Hanover. They ended up at the State Archive in Hanover. And let me show it again. This is now a reprint, like from these films, since the original registers were lost. This is now a reprint from these Garterman films, and so it shows the poor quality of it. And when we're looking at Lower Saxony today, it's like basically everything that's yellow in here, that used to be the Kingdom of Hanover. And then you have the Duchy of Oldenburg, and the blue spots here are the Duchy of Braunschweig or Brunswick. So Lower Saxony in itself, you saw what a big territory it is, and so it's really there were like also many different districts and areas, and so a lot of different historical events and different stories around like which Jewish congregations were formed. So let me just like give you an average of that. The first in the Kingdom of Hanover, the first Jews arrived approximately in the mid-1200s. In the city of Hanover, the capital of the kingdom, the first Jew arrived in 1303, and settlement began in the mid-1300s. Then again, it's like I mentioned, they were chased away, they were blamed for certain things like the Black Death, and it took until the 1600s that Jewish settlements took up again in these areas. And since the early 1700s, there are then the first listings of Jews, like court Jews for the Kingdom of Hanover. And most of the records, I mentioned that before, it was like also important for the Jewish history, and hence also for the records that exist today, is that there was a consistorium for Jewish religion in 1808, which really gave special rights about like the settlement, about the education, about the religion. And Jewish civil records became mandatory as of June 1844. And these like reprints of these films are available at Hanover at the State Archive. And this also not just the birth, marriage, and death records, as I showed example before, but there's also the family books of the state rabbi. And other, it's also like other records for the area of nowadays Lower Saxony are also located at the State Archive in Leipzig, where there are more films available, and also make sure to check the other sub-state archives in Aurich, etc. So here's an example of what a family book written by the rabbi looks like. So that was for the town of Patterson, and you have the names and the wife, and then all the children and their birth dates. So that's a very nice source. In the former Duchy of Braunschweig, there was like the first Jews lived there from around 1280 until 1546. Then in the 1700s, you see the first family arrived 1707 again. And then by the mid-1700s, there were 30 families already. And you see that they started taking up more importance, or like also the group, the population grew. And so as of 1771, for example, there are printed forms for these protection letters that I mentioned before. Again, they had freedom under Napoleon, which they were stripped of again after his defeat. From 1827 on, it was compulsory to educate Jewish children. And since 1832, Jews had the right to vote and take public offices. The records, like Jewish and other civil and other Jewish records, are located at the State Archive in Wolfenbüttel and cover this period. And of course, like when I say such a time frame or mention such a time frame, you have to understand that these records overlap. There may be some gaps in the years, but just like to give you a rough idea of like the time frame where there is a chance to find records. And also for this area, again, there are more records available in in Leipzig, I'm not sure. Since I always went to the local archives, I have to admit that I did not look at the records in Leipzig yet, so I don't know if they are identical or if they may differ. We have the former Duchy of Oldenburg also, which is similar to Hanover, has both a city by this name and then the duchy by this name. And so the first Jews arrived in the 1330s and then came back again in the late 1600s. And in Oldenburg city, you had in 1705, you had one family, and by the mid-1850s, you had 104 Jews living there. In the county, you see, there were even like the population was a lot bigger. So the records are located at the State Archive in Oldenburg. Here you see like the years that are available. There are also lists with the graves of the big Jewish cemeteries. And I show you some of these records. Like this is, for example, this is a general register of all established Jews living in the Duchy of Oldenburg in 1828. So you find these records too. This is one of the reasons why I mentioned also the Christian church books, because here's a great example of a Isaac Salomon called Müller, who then converted to become Lutheran, and he changed his name to Wilhelm Georg Isaac Salomon Müller. And what is interesting to see here also is that he was a sergeant of the 6th Company of the 1st Regiment. So that means you will see that Jews also served in the military. So it's always good to check also with military records, like local, if that's also a possibility where you may find more information about your ancestors. And before I forget to mention that, before we get to Bremen, it is actually also on top of just looking for records of Jewish congregations, like the general civil records, it's also always important to see and look at the online finding aids and actually ask and search for your ancestors by names, because at most of these archives, there are also many, many individual files. If there were lawsuits, if there were special inquiries or anything about related to business or testaments or other records that might exist, where you have a good chance to actually find personal records sorted by the names of your ancestors in these archives that are mentioned here today. So with Bremen, it was actually interesting. Bremen, as you may know it as this big immigration port, but yet the first Jew that was ever mentioned in Bremen was actually a Jewish advisor to one of the rulers in the year 1063. They came from from Flandern in Belgium. So, but really, it's like the first real then documented Jewish life was really as late as the 14th century. And basically, Bremen did not want to have Jews within, to take up settlement within Bremen. And so that's why they settled outside of Bremen in Hastedt. And the Jewish congregation in Bremen was founded as late as 1803. And you will, like, if you listen to my presentation about the immigration also, you will see, like, you see, in 1850, only 20 Jewish families lived in Bremen. And that's why the port of Bremen was never so important for Jewish families or Jews to use as an immigration port. So that's why Hamburg was always more popular, because the population, the government, everyone in Germany was much more open and welcoming to Jews there. And you see, it's like from 1880, so after Napoleon left, until 1849, no Jews were allowed in Bremen. And so that's why you only find very little records there. And actually, there's a very, very active local genealogy society. It's called Die Maus, and they have a database with all records from Bremen and surrounding areas. So do check their website and this database if you have ancestors from that area. Of course, there's also mentioned that there are records also at the Central Archives of the History of Jewish persons in Jerusalem, as well as in Yad Vashem. So now we're coming to the next free city, Hamburg, my hometown. And when I'm talking, this is a map from 1912. When I'm talking about Hamburg, you will also hear me talk about, so old town Hamburg, like what the old center of Hamburg was really just this small area. And when you see this big port and Elbe River, you can understand why this was a big immigration port. So and now when we talk about the Jewish congregation in Hamburg, we also have to mention not just Hamburg and then other areas that were later added to it, but we also have to talk about Wandsbek, which used to be in Holstein, but most importantly, and you guessed it, I mentioned it before, Altona, right here outside of the former city border. This is Altona. Again, in basically this is like these three congregations had very close ties from the very beginning, and that is that so the first Jews that arrived in Hamburg were in the late 1500s, and they were Sephardic Jews coming from Portugal. The Ashkenazi Jews were first and initially employees of these Sephardic Jews, and then they were sent away and they settled in Altona. So whenever there was like anything like an issue going on in Hamburg, in Altona, they were much more liberal. Now we'll talk about this in a second. So it's like, however, then in 1671, the Dreigemeinde, the three community or three congregation, was founded consisting out of the congregations of Altona, Hamburg, and Wandsbek. And this existed until 1812. You guessed it, Napoleon was there again. And for the city of Hamburg, we have this, important also, before I forget this, the chief rabbi of this association had his seat in Altona. And he also exercised jurisdiction over the Jews in the Duchy of Holstein. So you see, like he was had quite an important position there. In 1812, when this combined congregation basically was basically discontinued, there were 6,300 members in this congregation, and that was the biggest congregation in Germany at that time. And in the 1850s, there were over 10,000 members in the Jewish congregation. So, and basically what is also important to know about this is like all the records, we are in a very, very lucky position to have a vast collection of Jewish records covering Altona, Hamburg, Wandsbek, even Harburg, that whole area. And basically what happened was that after the Second World War, the archives in Jerusalem came and approached local archives in Germany and asked them to hand over any Jewish records that they still had. And it was actually that the archivist in Hamburg refused to do that. And so it went to a trial. And in the 1950s, the settlement was reached. And so basically the collection of Hamburg was split in half. And half of the originals stayed in Hamburg and half of the originals were given to Jerusalem. However, both parties agreed to make microfilm copies of their original set of records, and these were exchanged so that both archives basically have the complete set of records of this collection. However, one has half in original and the other half is on microfilm. And for the last few years, there was also a big effort to digitize all of these images. I heard that there are plans to actually put them on the internet and make them available. However, anything at the State Archive in Hamburg takes its time, and so it will certainly probably be still quite another time, a few years possibly, until this actually will happen. So but now enough said about this. We do have, again, I mentioned we have a lot of records there. It's really amazing. And we have civil records of the Ashkenazi communities starting in 1769, going through 1874, when it was the beginning of the official civil certificates that were started in the German Empire and that were started for any person living in Germany, regardless of their origin, beliefs, faiths, anything. So in the Sephardic births, only the births exist, but therefore they begin in 1749 and go through 1900. We have congregation membership lists, we have tax lists, we have testaments, marriage contracts, divorces, lists of foreigners, you like even records about intermarriages and the children. So you see there's a lot to be found there. And even in Leipzig, again, you find some records. As I mentioned before, I have never looked at them because if I have the originals right in front of my doorstep, then I don't need to travel to Leipzig to go there. So here are some examples of the different birth records, for example. So this is like the first records where it's like from the 1769 onwards. Here you have Hebrew birth records, and these are later, like I showed you the marriage record before. So these are later like these structured, organized, printed birth registers going into the 1860s. I mentioned Altona. Again, it's like the Danish king was also the Duke of Holstein and of Schleswig, and that goes back to the 1460s already. And Altona was the biggest city in Holstein. At times it was, after Copenhagen, actually the second biggest city in the Danish territory. You had the first Jews documented in 1584. And since 1640, the Danish king really granted liberal living conditions. And that's why Altona was very popular also by Jews in Hamburg, again, during more challenging times there. In 1835, however, there were still then only 2,000 members in this Altona congregation. I mentioned the numbers for Hamburg. Again, the civil records begin for Altona itself. They begin in 1795 and they go through 1937. They are located at the State Archive, and 1937 again is the cutoff date because that was the year when Altona, Wandsbek, Harburg, and other areas became part of the city-state of Hamburg. And with the Altona chief rabbi being responsible for ceremonial and civil cases and having the jurisdiction over Schleswig-Holstein's communities, you will also find records about other Schleswig-Holstein communities here within the collection of the Altona Jewish community. Like there are reports, for example, of the Altona as the chief rabbi visiting Russian POWs during World War I in camps that were imprisoned camps that were located in Schleswig-Holstein. So you can find names there too. So we do have great cemeteries also. So it's like in Hamburg, we have the biggest park cemetery from all of Europe. And while usually, like with Christian graves, our graves are only rented for 25 years, and then the stones are taken down and the grave ceases to exist. We know that Jewish cemeteries like this, everything lasts for eternity. And originally there were 11 cemeteries in Hamburg. The biggest one is still many of the old graves from some of these 11 cemeteries were moved to the Jewish cemetery section in Ohlsdorf. You can see them there. Other cemeteries in Hamburg today are located in Altona, Bahrenfeld, Wandsbek, Harburg, and there's even an Orthodox cemetery, a smaller one in Langenfelde. When you go to the cemetery in Ohlsdorf, this gentleman who unfortunately retired, he was the nicest guy, and he really loved his job. He was responsible for the whole Jewish cemetery in Ohlsdorf, and so he had these handwritten indexes, and then it gave you the grave number, and then he had this great map on the wall where he would then identify the location of the grave. And since some of the headstones are just like grown over and it's difficult to find, so but he was really great to have him by your side if you wanted to visit any of. He was actually the keeper of all the keys to all of the Jewish cemeteries. So again, unfortunately, he retired a few years ago, so but he couldn't have been any nicer. So Schleswig-Holstein, I mentioned it. Oh, and we already need to speed up a little bit here. Okay, great. There were several Jewish communities, congregations. I see them there. Basically, civil equality in the Duchy of Schleswig only came in 1854, and in Holstein it took until 1863, and only under the Prussian rule, like really equal rights between Jews and non-Jews. Took as late as 1869. One of the big, usually like some of the records are located at the State Archive in Schleswig, and they cover these years, 1850 through 1941. Some records are located again in Leipzig, covering another period. Some, I mentioned them at the State Archive in Hamburg, not so much civil records, but more like these records when Jews had to deal with the chief rabbi from Altona. And an invaluable source really is the local city archives. I will show some examples from Friedrichstadt, which had a very big Jewish community, and I show some examples in a second. And then last but not least, just fairly recently, I was made aware of a Danish Jewish database. And since so many of the Jews were also merchants, particularly in that area with the Baltic Sea and the North Sea, it's like surrounded, and you had Hamburg and you had Altona with ports, and you had Lübeck as a merchant city. So there were close ties to Copenhagen, and that's why you do find many also like Jews who actually lived in Germany in this database. This database is only, you have to pay for the membership, but it is very interesting. I mentioned Friedrichstadt. Here's an example of what the birth records looked like there. You have here, you have family files where you usually have you have the husband, you have the wife, you have his birth information, her birth information. Here you even the name of the wife's father. Usually on the back you would list any children that they have. Since Schleswig-Holstein again was part of Denmark, you also will find the Danish census records there. So that's really cool. And so here's an example what in a sense of 1845, the Jewish family that lived in Friedrichstadt, excuse me. So again, not in every part of Germany were census records taken. So that's again to be kept in mind. For Lübeck, as per Lübeck law, it was forbidden for Jews to reside within the city wall. And that basically was the case until the 1650s, when the first Jews came from Poland and Lithuania. And they arrived and settled in that area, however, again, still outside of the city gates in the nearby town of Meusling. Meusling was then part of Denmark and had no restrictions as per the liberal Danish rights. And their first synagogue there was built in 1702, and as late as like really in 1812, again, Napoleon, you guessed it, that was when the first congregation in Lübeck within the city walls was founded. They had to leave, they were asked to leave again after Napoleon left, and only as late as the 1848 is when they were allowed to return. In 1857, a total of 522 Jews lived in Lübeck. You see the name, the dates of the records that are available. There was a conscription of Jews into military as of 1831. There are the military records again. You have citizens' rights begin in 1848 and more settled than in 1852. You have address books, census records, and civil records to look at, and you can find them at the wonderful City Archive in Lübeck. Interestingly enough, there were also some digitized records from Lübeck at the Central Archive of Jews in Heidelberg, such as this birth record covering the births from 1848 until 1888. You have incoming persons lists from 1819 until 1901. It's my understanding that this collection is part of something that they found at the State Archive in Hamburg. And since it didn't pertain to Hamburg anymore, it was then eventually handed over to the Central Archive of Jews in Heidelberg. Mecklenburg-Schwerin. Basically, Mecklenburg-Schwerin, you see it were like two different, like it used to be like one duchy in Strelitz. Mecklenburg-Strelitz became independent in 1701. Jews lived there until 1492 and then returned in the 1660s again. Interestingly enough, the Hanseatic cities of Rostock and Wismar banned Jews up until as late as 1867. In Mecklenburg-Schwerin, around 1800, there were 300 Jews living. And in Mecklenburg-Strelitz, you had this protected system going from 1704, like when the first Jews arrived, lasting as long as 1852. The civil records begin in 1813. There's Napoleon again, and they are located at the State Archive in Schwerin. Also make sure to check with local city archives. Here are a few lists, examples. You have the protected Jews in Mecklenburg-Schwerin going up until for the first half of the 19th century. You have protection fee payments in Mecklenburg-Strelitz up until 1823 with the name, first name, last name, and when the payment was made. And you have last name adoption list for Mecklenburg-Strelitz after 1814. And now we come to, again, to this, so this is like, now we come to the general parts, other regions, other archives where you may find records. So look at the state archives in Germany, look at the also local city archives or district archives. If it was at all Prussian, check the secret Prussian State Archive in Berlin. There's the Centrum Judaicum in Berlin, where they have now also a big archive. I mean, it's mainly for Jews who lived in the area of Berlin, Brandenburg. However, there always were ties to other areas, so it's worth asking them. I mentioned the Central Archive for the research of the history of Jews in Germany in Heidelberg before. There are local Jewish museums, Rendsburg in Schleswig-Holstein, Frankfurt, Munich, Berlin. There's a Central Archive for the history of the Jewish people in Jerusalem, as well as Yad Vashem, you know, Jewish Gen.org, as well as Family Search.org, not to forget MyHeritage and Ancestry also as other possible sources. And if it comes to records that like if there are no civil records in that area, there still may be other records that may be of interest for you to look at. So look at the local address and phone books. You may find your ancestors' date, their businesses listed. There may be listings, clippings in newspapers about any events that pertain to them. You have in the 19th century, usually the registration of foreigners begin. And in like, this is an example of the resident registration cards in Hamburg that began in 1892. And here you have like, you have my Samuel Lyon Pincus, who came from Lübeck, and then he later, and then you have all his information, where he came from, his profession, his children, where they were born, and he moved to Copenhagen. So he's the person where I got a lot of information, both in Lübeck and in Hamburg, because he married a girl from Altona, they had children in Hamburg. And last but not least, he moved to Copenhagen. So in this Danish database I mentioned, I found him again. So when they were allowed to become citizens, you may find citizenship application files. You may find passport applications, usually when they traveled around for business, for example. There are commercial registers. This is like about a company that was founded, and you have even personal information when the owner of the business died and when it was passed on to his son. You find these like vital records in this kind of records. I mentioned military records a couple of times, so this is not a Jewish example, but do look at military records. You may find them there. And you have court and legal documents such as this testament. So there again, you have like also children, other relatives listed in there. So, and with this, I finally come to the conclusion of my presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me here. These are my contact information. And otherwise, I promised you, here's the code again to evaluate my presentation. I hope you liked it and enjoyed it and learned a little bit. And I'm looking forward to hearing you and maybe seeing you one day. Thank you. Bye-bye.